Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. Welcome to Must Read TV, the Skylark Bookshop Virtual Authors Series. My name is Alex George, and I'm the owner of Skylark, which is an independent bookstore located in downtown Columbia, Missouri. We are thrilled to welcome, for this earlier than usual edition, a former US Poet Laureate and Pulitzer Prize winner, Natasha Trethewey, who is here to discuss her memoir, Memorial Drive. The book was an instant New York Times bestseller. The Boston Globe described it as a luminous and searing work, and the Washington Post called it alternately beautiful and devastating. Natasha is, as I said, a former US Poet Laureate and the author of 5 collections of poetry, as well as a book of creative nonfiction. She is currently the Board of Trustees Professor of English at Northwestern University. In 2007, she won the Pulitzer Prize in Poetry for her collection, Native Guard. I'm also very pleased to welcome Katherine Reed to Skylark this evening, who will be interviewing Natasha. In addition to being a professor at the University of Missouri School of Journalism, Katherine has a close link to Skylark in that her son, Elliot Reed, is a very fine novelist, and we hosted the launch party for his debut novel, A Key to Treehouse Living, which was also, in fact, the very first event that we ever hosted at the shop. So we have always had a very soft spot for the whole Reed clan. Katherine and Natasha are going to be in conversation for about 45 minutes or so, and after that they'll be turning to questions. So if you have any questions, please do pop them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. If you are watching on Facebook, you can type a question in the comments as well. If you enjoyed this evening's conversation, please consider purchasing Memorial Drive from Skylark Bookshop. You can do that by ordering online at our online website. The book is front and center in the middle of the front page there, or you can email us at mail@skylarkbookshop.com, or you can give us a call at 573-777-6990 to make an order, and we will take care of that for you. All right, that's me done. I will now make myself disappear and turn it over to Katherine and Natasha.
All right, thanks Alex. So thank you for coming. I don't know who's out there. It's impossible to tell, but thank you, Natasha, too, for taking time to talk about this book. I'm just going to offer a friendly amendment to that introduction, that in addition to being Elliot Reed's proud mother, I teach a course on trauma reporting in the School of Journalism here at MU. And so in addition to being really interested in this book because Natasha wrote it, and because years ago, Natasha, you shared this story with me when we were at Hollins together. It's also a rare sort of memoir for those of us who are interested in learning more about the experience of trauma and trauma survivors and memory of trauma. So I also want to say thank you for writing this book. I'm guessing that this was one of the harder things you've ever undertaken.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm going to read one sentence to get us started. All those years I thought that I had been running away from my past, I had in fact been working my way steadily back to it. So your mother in life and in death and even after death has been such a powerful part of your poetry. Can you talk about the need that you felt that's so apparent in this memoir to really excavate the facts of what happened to her?
Yeah, one of the things I talk about a good deal in the book is the over 30 years that I spent trying to forget.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't really begin to do this excavation until it felt like a real necessity. The more that my own career took off, the more I was written about.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was written about, my backstory became part of the story that journalists would write about. And in that backstory, there was always a mention of my mother, but a very small mention of my mother as if she were a footnote,
Mm-hmm.
or merely a victim or a murdered woman. And that really, it hurt me because I felt like she was being erased. I felt like people were not grasping how important she was in making me who I am and the writer that I am.
Right.
And so I decided that I needed to tell the story. I needed to put her in her proper place as the woman who made me. And so that's what began that difficult work of excavation.
Right. And it's a very separate need, right, from that which has been fulfilled through your poetry, right? I guess I'm getting at sort of a question about writing here, which is this very a more direct approach through the memoir, right?
Yeah.
And,
well, the writing of poems, the mask that one wears as a poet, even a poet like me, a poet who writes deeply autobiographical poems. I write from my own experience, and yet the polished formalism of a poem, the neat, the elegant envelope of form, those are things that allow a kind of distance, as well as a kind of restraint. Certainly, they are also, I think, deeply emotional, and yet it's the kind of emotion that is like the pressure form puts on it, the vice grip of that allows a different kind of control.
right.
Writing prose, I did not feel that same kind of control, because I think there has to be a different kind of transparency, even as obviously the prose is formal too, and the shape of the book and the order in which the story is told all has to do with its formal qualities, and yet it required a deeper telling, one that was less about restraint, even though it is still made up of silences. There was much more to be revealed. And I think even the process of the excavation is what is revealed in the book as well.
Right, exactly, yeah. Can I ask you to read a little bit here from the book? It's called Terminus, 51 to halfway through 53, end of italics.
Yeah. So this is the second chapter, Terminus. For a long time, I tried to forget as much as I could of the 12 years between 1973 and 1985. I wanted to banish that part of my past, an act of self-creation by which I sought to be made only of what I consciously chose to remember. I chose to mark the calendar year just after my mother and I left Mississippi as ending, and the moment of loss, her death, as beginning. Those 2 years would be like the set of bookends I'd kept on my desk back then, 2 small globes imprinted with a sepia map of the world, bracketing a few favorite volumes, Wuthering Heights, The Great Gatsby, Light in August. In my attempt at willed forgetting, I would collapse the distance between bookends, the year that ended the world of my happy early childhood, pressing right up against the new world I'd entered suddenly as a motherless child. The years 1973 and 1985, side by side, with no books between them, no pages upon which the story I could not bear to remember had been written. But there is a danger in willed forgetting. Too much can be lost. It's been harder for me to call back my mother when I've needed to most. Of course, we're made up of what we've forgotten too, what we've tried to bury or suppress. Some forgetting is necessary, and the mind works to shield us from things that are too painful. Even so, some aspect of trauma lives on in the body from which it can reemerge unexpectedly. Even when I was trying to bury the past, there were moments from those lost years that kept coming back, rising to mine unbidden. Those memories, some intrusive, some lovely, seem now to have a grander significance, like signposts on a path. It's a path I can see now only because I've followed it backward, attempting to find a moment of revelation, evidence of something being set in motion. There's a scene like that from the first few months after my mother and I moved to Atlanta. It is winter, early evening, and I am watching as she changes out of the clothes she's worn to class and dresses for work. I can see her from the space that is my room, a closet off her bedroom barely large enough to hold my twin bed. The daffodils I picked for her on the way home from school are doubled in the mirror on her dresser. I watch her as the sky goes dark, street lamps just coming on outside the small window above me. There must be someone else in the apartment, someone there to watch over me while she is gone, but I don't remember that part. I know only that I will sleep, and in the morning she will be there again. So I stay awake until she leaves, wearing the uniform required for her job as a cocktail waitress in underground Atlanta. Black leotard and jeans, a heavy brass bullet belt slung low around her slender hips. I see it so clearly now, my young mother bending to kiss me, the bullet's cold metal brushing my hand, her body ringed in the objects of her undoing.
Thank you. So you talk in the book about the effect it had on you to finally say aloud you were going to write this book. So how did you start this painful work? And what did you feel you had to do to begin after all these years?
I started because I thought it was absolutely necessary to give a sense to the reader of the world that we left behind. The close-knit family, my mother's extended family, my father, that early world of my childhood, the first 6 years of my childhood, I felt like I needed to show both the people who had loved her there um, before I could then move on to try to look at all the things that happened after that, when our lives began to fall apart. And I must have taken, I probably was years, it seems, writing the first chapter, and even the part that I just read, that's the beginning of the second chapter, because part of that second chapter, it's still just the two of us in Atlanta before the man who will kill her enters our lives. I wanted to stay in those chapters. I wanted to dwell there and never move forward because I know what was coming. So it took me a long time to get out of those and move forward.
Right. Oh, of course. So we learn in the book that before the trauma of your mother's death, there was the trauma of your stepfather's psychological torment of you. And that you kept to yourself for a long time. And, when you and I talked about this years ago, I don't remember you ever sharing that part of the story. And I wonder if that too has been something that over the years that you have become more cognizant of, or that's something that you've thought about more, the way that he especially exploited your fear, the fear of all children, which is that you'll be abandoned somewhere and never see your mother again.
Yeah, I was thinking about how when you and I met and were together that year at school, it was only 5 years since she'd been dead.
Right.
And I can't exactly remember what parts of the story I was telling. I think I probably talked a lot about the actual day of being at school at the university and getting the call and making the call and then being driven back, and perhaps a little bit about Valentine's Day in 1984 when he tried to kill her the first time.
Yes.
I do know that at some point I did begin to tell the story of him driving me around on 285, making up reasons to punish me. And the punishment was that he would tell me that I needed to be committed. My mother at that time worked at a mental health facility in personnel, and he would tell me that I needed to be committed and make me pack my bags and load me into the car and drive around for a long time as I cried until he decided I had suffered enough, and then he would take me back home. I think even as a child, as I was terrified that, that I would be abandoned one day, the older I got, the more I began to see it as part of a pattern of behavior of his. And so by the time I was a teenager, I could push back against it and against that fear a little bit more. But even now, I still don't know why I never said anything about it. In the book, I talk about knowing that I was thinking I was a good child, and that it was my place to accept the life that was made for me by adults. I had also talked to someone not too long ago who told me that one of the amazing things about abusers is that, especially ones who are abusing children, they don't ever have to tell you not to say anything. Somehow there's something that prevents you from telling, whether it be the fear of abandonment, that there would be some punishment even for telling, or the shame of it, perhaps. I don't know.
And it sort of intersects with something you talk about when you talk about not telling your mother, wanting to be the good girl, keeping things, not wanting to make things harder for her at a time that was, already really hard. And someone speculated in an interview they'd done with you, or maybe in a review of the book, that they thought you had survivor's guilt for having not said anything about what Joel was doing, or for the smile and the wave, hey, Big Joe. Do you want to talk about that incident and your own feelings about whether or not, is it a kind of survivor's guilt? My sense is it's something more complicated than that. But maybe it's in there somewhere.
I think it is. I think, the opening dream of the book. Now, this is something that I think I was always telling. I even tried writing about that dream when I first started trying to be a poet. But in the dream, we're walking around, my mother and I, something like an oval track. And we're side by side, and I know she's dead. And it feels like, I'm Orpheus, gone down into the underworld to see Eurydice or something. And, there on that path that my mother and I are walking, from the other direction, Joel comes toward us. And when he comes toward us, that's when I wave at him and speak a little greeting. And then he walks by us, and my mother turns to me, and she's got a hole in the center of her forehead, the size of a quarter, lights streaming from it. And she says, "Do you know what it means to have a wound that never heals?" And as we make the path around again, that's when he appears again, but this time he's holding a gun and aiming it at her. And in the dream, I think that I can throw myself in between her and the gun, in the bullet's path, and I scream in the dream, and my own voice wakes me up. I've been thinking about that dream and telling the story of what happens in that dream for years, but it took me a long time to connect it to something that had actually happened. This is why I use that quote from Faulkner in the end of the book, memory knows before knowing remembers.
Yes.
That somehow it was, buried in the recesses of my consciousness, that indeed I was down on a track with the other cheerleaders at a football game the week that we ran away, and my mother was in hiding in a shelter for battered women. And he knew that he could find me at the game because he couldn't find her. And when he walked into the stadium, I saw him. He walked down and he sat right in front of me, and I couldn't ignore him anymore. And that's when I waved and spoke that greeting to him. And later on, he told a psychiatrist that he had come there with the intention of killing me in order to punish my mother for leaving, but that he hadn't done it because I smiled and waved and spoke to him. And I think the moment that I was conscious of that, when I read that, and even afterwards, when he did what he did, I began to think that if indeed he had shot me then and there, I'd be the one dead and she'd be alive because they would have arrested him for her murder. I mean, for my murder instead of hers. And so I think I have carried, I've carried that guilt for a long time, and it begins to reveal itself to you in subtle ways. I think the first time it revealed itself to me, that I was carrying this kind of survivor's guilt, was in a poem in Native Guard called Genus Narcissus. This is a poem that began with me just remembering picking flowers for my mother that first year in Atlanta. And it would be daffodils that just grew wild, on my path home from school. And I picked them for her. And so I just began the poem by writing that. And then it didn't go anywhere else. I mean, because it was just a sweet memory and there was nowhere else for it to go. And so I did what I often do when I get stuck in a poem. I decided that I didn't know enough. And so I needed to do some research. So the first research I did was try to find out something about the language of flowers, because I remembered being told at some point in my childhood that flowers had a language and that there were flowers that were appropriate for different occasions. If you were going to someone's home for dinner, there were flowers in certain colors that were appropriate to bring and some that were not. So I wanted to know what the flowers that I gave my mother, the daffodils, symbolized. So I went to my OED, I looked them up and discovered a couple of things. One, that the daffodil is a genus Narcissus. So it's a narcissus flower, the flower that that Persephone picks, that opens the earth and takes her, which is how she's taken into the underworld, because she picks the flower and the earth splits beneath her. It's also, the OED tells us that, daffodils bloom early. They have a short spring. They bloom early and they die early. And also there was an epigraph from the poet that read, fair daffodils, we weep to see you haste away so soon. So the moment that I understood that I had given my mother not only a flower that said die early, but also the flower that, again, Persephone picked, that opened up the underworld. The poet Mark Doty says our metaphors go on ahead of us. I think that was waiting for me to discover it.
Yes.
And it told me, indeed, in the language of the poem that I was writing, that I'd been carrying that guilt with me a long time, that somehow I had helped to usher in her doom.
I want to shift a little bit and talk about the story of your mother's interaction with you when you talked to her about the abuse that you knew what was happening, that you knew was happening, and she gave you a journal for your 12th birthday. In my first act of resistance, because of the way you used this journal, I had inadvertently made him my first audience, you write. And what you had done was when you realized that Joel had broken the lock and was reading your journal, you left some pretty,
choice words.
Some choice words for him, some admonishments. But I also was so moved by that journal, the gift of the journal, that she was encouraging you to write things down that you two were having trouble talking about, not because she was going to read it, but to give you that outlet. And I want to ask you if you would please read, because it gives me so much joy to read pages 111 through 113 in accounting, when you're talking about the day she stands up for you about your dreams.
Did you want me to read that whole?
Well, 111, is it long?
Well, no, you said 111 to 113. It's pretty short, actually.
Yeah, that part.
Okay. Accounting. One day I come home from school giddy with news. It is early evening and the four of us take our seats at the kitchen table. Most days during the week I have practice after school and get home too late for these family dinners. Joel will already have left the house on those nights, so there are blessed stretches of days when I don't see him at all. Tonight, though, I'm too excited to save my news for when I can tell my mother alone, so I blurt it out as soon as we sit down. Not only have I been promoted to editor of the newspaper staff, but also because of a short story I wrote, I've been invited to join Quill and Scroll, the club responsible for putting out the school literary journal. I can see the delight in my mother's face. She is smiling at me, and I am like a daffodil, lifting my face to the sun. I go on about how much I love the short story reader we are using in English class, how John Updike's A&P is my favorite so far, how I am planning to write a news story for an upcoming issue. I'm going to be a writer, I announce. You're not going to do any of that, Joel says, shrugging his shoulders. He doesn't even look up from his plate when he says it. My mother is seated to my right, and I see her out of the corner of my eye, a deep furrow between her brows, her jaw clenched so tight, she seems to speak with her mouth closed. She will do whatever she wants. I am stunned, my head bent now toward my own plate, afraid to look at her or provoke him further by meeting his eyes across the table. For years, she has held her tongue, encouraging me mostly in private so as to avoid his jealous anger. This moment is different, and I know the cost. She's going to be beaten for that tonight, I think. The tone, even inside my head, resigned, matter of fact. The rest of dinner we eat in silence, Joel glowering, my mother in quiet defiance. I'm stealing glances at her face, thinking of the bruises she'll wear tomorrow, all the hidden places on her body soft with pain, calculating the price she'll keep paying to save me. I've replayed this scene in my head countless times. She will do whatever she wants. Even now, I hear in my mother's voice her measured restraint, the origins of my own. I think, or I hope that readers get to hear the measured restraint of her voice when you get to the second half of the book and you actually you read the transcripts of those phone conversations.
Yeah.
My mother had to, because she was trying to get they'd been divorced for nearly 2 years, and he continued to stalk her. And she was working with the assistant district attorney to get an arrest warrant. And they told her that it wasn't enough to have her word against his, that they needed evidence. So they set up a tape recording device in her apartment so that she could record him when he called and made his terroristic threats on the phone. So she, for 2 days leading up to the day that she's murdered, she has conversations with him on the phone where he's basically telling her, you have a choice, 2 choices, come back to me or die. And she refuses. She tells him that she's not going to come back to him. She's not even going to say that in order to, get him to leave her alone a little bit. She doesn't make any promises. And you just hear her restraint and her patience and her resilience, even in the face of the kinds of horrible threats he's making.
Yeah, I was really, really struck by that she never lost patience with him, and that she keeps repeating the same thing to him over and over again. She did so many things right. And that she recorded conversations, and she cooperated in every possible way and gave, law enforcement, prosecutors, everything they needed, and still everyone failed her.
Still.
Yeah, and still. So I want to ask you about your anger, knowing all that you know now about what happened to her, and knowing that domestic violence is still such a problem in this country. In journalism, we hardly know what to write about it anymore, because there is so much out there and so many stories to tell. What do you think has to change?
Oh, so much. Where to
Yeah.
start? Well, I think the public really does have to be educated about the complexity of situations that people who are victims of domestic or partner violence find themselves in.
Mhm.
I've heard too many attitudes of people who seem to think that this is a choice, that these women have made their bed, so they should lie in it.
Right.
I used to have conversations with my father about this all the time, because my father grew up in a household of domestic violence too. His stepfather was abusive toward his mother. And my father and I saw the situation very differently. My father has this wonderful poem called The Listeners. And it's sort of about the children who are hearing the domestic violence. And there's a part in the poem where they can hear the fight that's getting started downstairs. Mm-hmm. And the lines read something like, old wrongs rising in her voice, blind as needing to be put right. He's talking about the argument that his mother is getting into with her husband. And, the children, want to drag her off to bed so she doesn't do anything to provoke him. And so this is one of the things that we would talk about, that somehow her demand for him to atone or to have a conversation, to answer to old wrongs, is somehow worthy of him hitting her,
right,
or stabbing her in the stomach with a knife.
Mm-hmm.
That somehow just her words are enough to provoke violence, and that's somehow her fault as opposed to his.
Right.
That's one thing.
Yeah.
so that, you know, women who are abused are somehow supposed to be in the position of de-escalating everything, that it's their fault if they get beaten. Society tells them this in so many ways. I think we also need to educate law enforcement a little bit more. I mean, my mother tells the story in that I have in the book of sitting at the kitchen table with Joel threatening her one night, and he says to her that he's got a gun, and he jumps up from the table to go outside, and she thinks he's going to get it. So she quietly locks the door behind him and calls the police. When the police get there, you know, Joel is saying, oh, I would never hurt her. I love her. And the police, as my mother says, leave all smiles. And then they go back inside the house, and he tells her, if you ever do that again, I'll kill you.
Right.
I think that people don't understand that that moment itself is dangerous for her. And that if they take him in at that moment, if she says, yes, take him, chances are he's going to be out and come back and do what he started. Right. This is a man who went to jail for trying to kill her, got out and came back and finished what he started. Right. So there are reasons that, you know, women, and that given that moment, may not let their abusers go back, because the statistics suggest that when a woman leaves, she's more likely to die. Right. Than when she stays. I don't think people know that either. Right. That is the more dangerous thing, leaving. So my mother's decision to leave, you know, was the most dangerous decision, because that was more likely to get her killed. I think we also, you know, these are, again, things that are about my own experience. You know, I've written about these things in poems. You know, my father would say things like, you know, why would she marry a guy like that? As if she sought out someone who was going to beat her up, or that abusers somehow do what they do on the first date. You know what? I'm a poet, and I really feel like this is better said in my poem than me trying to explain it. So if I could just read the poem. Yeah. You know, I wrote this poem while working on the memoir, because sometimes things in the memoir needed to come out as a poem instead of prose. So I turn a sheet over and I'd write a poem. And this is one of the poems that came out. It's called Imperatives for Carrying On in the Aftermath. Do not hang your head or clench your fists when even your friend, after hearing the story, says, my mother would never put up with that. Fight the urge to rattle off statistics that, more often, a woman who chooses to leave is then murdered. The 100th time your father says, but she hated violence, why would she marry a guy like that? Don't waste your breath explaining again how abusers wait, are patient, that they don't beat you on the first date, sometimes not even the first few years of a marriage. Keep an impassive face whenever you hear stand by your man, and let go your rage when you recall those words were advice given your mother. Try to forget the first trial before she was dead, when the charge was only attempted murder. Don't belabor the thinking or the sentence that allowed her ex-husband's release a year later, or the juror who said, it's a domestic issue. They should work it out themselves. Just breathe when, after you read your poems about grief, a woman asks, do you think your mother was weak for men? Learn to ignore subtext. Imagine a thought cloud above your head, dark and heavy with the words you cannot say. Let silence rain down. Remember, you were told by your famous professor that you should write about something else. Unburden yourself of the death of your mother and just pour your heart out in the poems. Ask yourself what's in your heart, that reliquary blood locket and seed bed, and contend with what it means. The folk saying you learned from a Korean poet in Seoul, that one does not bury the mother's body in the ground, but in the chest. Or, like you carry her corpse on your back.
Yeah.
You know, a few years ago, I went to a fundraising event that a charity was having to raise money for domestic violence prevention.
Mhm.
And the event was a gala, you know, formal. And in between the courses and videos of women telling their stories, the couple who was hosting the event, a pair of socialites in Atlanta, said things like, well, you know, we really need to do something about this because it's happening to so many people. I mean, well, no one in this room
Yeah.
or not anyone that you know, but maybe someone who works for you might be a victim of domestic violence. So this idea that domestic violence was only happening to women of a certain class or of a certain race, that is one of the biggest misconceptions as well.
Yeah, it's very true. All right. Well, Natasha, thank you so much for reading Imperatives. I love that poem. I've read it like 3 times over the weekend. I have a couple questions here.
Okay.
Maddie said that she wants to know, is there a threshold, a moment when people become poets? When did you cross that threshold?
Mm.
And did you know when you crossed it?
I don't think I knew when I crossed it. At least I didn't know consciously. But the dream that I was talking to you about earlier, when my mother says to me, do you know what it means to have a wound that never heals? You know, back then I interpreted that um, in a more sort of basic sense that, I mean, she literally has the wound. And now I have a wound that, you know, even now I would tell my 19-year-old self that it's not going to heal. But this is, I realize, very connected to something that the poet Federico Garcia Lorca wrote about duende, the idea that the demon or that incarnates for a writer or an artist something about the nature of death, that an artist's work could be beautiful, but perhaps without that other knowledge, that wound, it may not transcend mere beauty. He writes, in trying to heal the wound that never heals lies the strangeness.
Mhm.
And so that wound that never heals, that phrase that I also utter, and I say I utter because if you believe dream theory, that in a dream you are also, the dreamer is also all of the characters in it.
Right.
It was as if I were telling myself that I had that wound, that I had the making of an artist, that I was.
Mm.
And indeed, the first poem I tried to write as an adult came in the weeks after her death, where I was trying to make sense of that loss in the only language that would seem to hold it. You know, I think about Liesel Mueller's wonderful poem, When I'm Asked, that begins, when I'm asked how I began writing poetry, I talk about the indifference of nature. She goes on to describe how beautiful the world was in the days following her mother's death, and how nothing seemed to be grieving, nothing seemed to be black or broken, she writes. And in the end, the end of the poem reads, So I placed my grief in the mouth of language, the only thing that would grieve with me.
Mm.
And I understand that so much. And I think a lot of people do, because it is after moments like that that I think so many people turn to the language of poetry to try to make sense of what seems unfathomable.
Right. Yes. Okay, so from Ellen, you referenced the poem, this was one of Rick's poems, about hearing, she says, neighbors fight. Are there any other books or poems or other resources that helped clarify your thinking and or illuminated your experience that you can share?
Okay, so yeah, that poem was a poem of my father's, where he's listening to his mother and stepfather fighting. You know, I didn't read other poems or even memoirs about domestic violence, except for, I guess is it Lacey Johnson's The Other Side? I hope I'm not getting that title wrong, because that's a powerful memoir about her own experience and surviving. I found that a book that was so useful to me to understand my own response to trauma was Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking.
Yes.
Because I see how much of a magical thinker I am, even now, even though my rational mind is quite aware of it. I'm still a magical thinker.
Wow. I loved that book.
I did too.
I want to talk for a second, because I don't have questions from other people, so I get to ask you more. You said that you pointed out quite rightly that you didn't just survive, but you have thrived. And, psychologists now really talk about something that they call post-traumatic growth. And it's kind of a concept that makes people very uncomfortable, as if it implies somehow that the trauma was a good thing that happened. And of course, no one would say the trauma was a good thing. It's just that we've become much more accustomed to the narrative of the violent act, the death of the beloved person, and then oblivion. After that, there's nothing beyond that point. So the psychologist Frank Ochberg, who we use a lot in the trauma reporting class, he's written about the 3 acts of trauma. He would say that your book represents Act 3 of trauma, which is the most difficult part of all, which is the search for meaning, trying to find meaning in those things that seem meaningless. Would you agree? Would you agree with that? Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the themes that I end the book on, that as a meaning-seeking creature, the overwhelming need to find not only a sense of purpose, but to give meaning to even the things that seem merely senseless or tragic. And so in my telling in this book, which is really in so many ways about me becoming the artist that I am, that if it becomes the narrative of my calling to be an artist, to contend with that wound that never heals,
Right.
Then indeed my mother's death is made meaningful as part of my own calling, as opposed to merely senseless. I think often about how I have no idea who I would be but for this defining moment in my life, which is why I kind of make those bookends, those brackets, which is why there's a before and an after. It is as if, the first 19 years of my life, I was someone. And then, to go back to that other question, there was a threshold through which I walked, and I was someone else.
Right.
Yeah. And because I like the person that I am,
yeah,
it means I have to accept everything that got me here.
right.
And to accept it isn't enough. It has to be meaningful.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, I don't see any other questions. Alex, are you there? You said you would cry. We got a lot of crying.
You started right in with the cry question.
I tried not to, but there I went and did it anyway.
No, that was great. It was just good to talk to you, Katherine.
Good to talk.
One more question has just popped up. Which I don't know if you want to go ahead and read that.
I will. That's one of my students, Sienna, who is a big fan of yours, Natasha. As a journalism student in love with literature and poetry, I'm wondering if you have advice for journalists on how we can let metaphor teach us, as you say in the book, and use language to hold complex and difficult topics. Thank you for being here tonight and sharing your wisdom.
Thank you. Well, that is a complex and difficult question. Well, I think often about sort of metaphors of mind. I mean, that we exist in the world always through metaphor. So much of our given language is already figurative, and I think to remember that, and to see it, as opposed to forgetting it. Katherine, I feel like you and I have talked about this before, like way back then, that how children early on see the world in figurative terms, in comparing this thing to that thing, but that somehow it gets taught out of us, and we begin to only say the thing and not the thing in representational terms, which is why I go back to what Mark Doty says, our metaphors go on ahead of us. They know before we do.
Right.
But also he thinks of them as the first guard, of the mind, that if we allow ourselves to look and to see things precisely, and then to see what they remind us of, to see what else we connect with them, it is a way of making metaphor out of just the ordinary events and things of our lives.
Right.
I try to tell my students that all the time. I mean, I'll just say this last thing. There's a poem of mine called Elegy. Maybe since I have time,Ll close out with one more poem. And this is a poem about my father, and a fishing trip that my father and I took a few years ago. And now I wrote this poem before my father was dead, and so it is not a typical kind of elegy. But I want listeners just to hear how precisely I try to describe exactly what happened. And then to think about how exactly what happened is so already full of figurative meaning. Elegy for my father. I think by now the river must be thick with salmon. Late August, I imagine it as it was that morning. Drizzle needling the surface, mist at the banks like a net settling around us, everything damp and shining. That morning, awkward and heavy in our hip waders, we stalked into the current and found our places, you upstream a few yards and out far deeper. You must remember how the river seeped in over your boots and you grew heavier with that defeat. All day I kept turning to watch you, how first you mimed our guide's casting, then cast your invisible line, slicing the sky between us. And later, rod in hand, how you tried again and again to find that perfect arc, flight of an insect skimming the river's surface. Perhaps you recall I cast my line and reeled in 2 small trout we could not keep. Because I had to release them, I confess I thought about the past, working the hooks loose, the fish writhing in my hands, each one slipping away before I could let go. I can tell you now that I tried to take it all in, record it for an elegy I'd write one day when the time came. Your daughter, I was that ruthless. What does it matter if I tell you I learned to be? You kept casting your line, and when it did not come back empty, it was tangled with mine. Some nights, dreaming, I step again into the small boat that carried us out and watch the bank receding, my back to where I know we are headed. So I just want to point out that, you know, things as simple as literally describing what happened. You know, my father in his hip waders going in too deep and the water filling up his boots. Well, he literally was heavier, but it's also that heaviness of crossing that river. And we know those mythological rivers and what they symbolize. And yet we were literally in that river fishing. When he's casting that line, you know, when you're practicing fly fishing and it keeps going between us, you know, that's literally what's happened, but it's also suggesting something being drawn between us. And then that later image of, you know, when he's not catching a fish and the line, when it doesn't come back empty, it's tangled. I mean, that's the entanglements of fathers and daughters.
Yeah.
So just what happened, you know, just by saying what happens, as Lowell would say and Heaney would say, there's already so much figurative power there.
Yes. Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I love that Didion book as well, and the Year of Magical Thinking and the Evening of Magical Conversation. So thank you both
Thank you,
for
Alex.
that. It's been wonderful. Just a few final notes for you all. We love to do these events and we're honored to do them, but in order to continue putting them on, we do need your support. So again, please do consider buying Natasha's book from Skylark Bookshop. You can go to the website or shoot us an email at mail@skylarkbookshop.com or 573-777-6990. Next up, tomorrow evening, we have another event with the two Steves. Steve Wittgenstein will be in conversation with Steve Yates about his wonderful new collection of short stories, Scattered Lights. And on December the 3rd, I will be speaking with my fellow Brit, Catherine May, about her astonishing new book, Wintering. And details of all of those events are on the website. So thank you again for being here. Natasha, Catherine, thank you both very, very much. That was a wonderful conversation. I look forward to seeing you all soon.
Can I say goodbye to Natasha, Alex?
I was going to say, can I say goodbye too before you?
Before you cut us off.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'd love to get to see you again. I hope when we're able to, you get to the Chicago area.
I do.
Yes.
When the pandemic is over, we'll come and ring a doorbell in Evanston, Illinois.
Yes, it would be love to see you and to drink a lot of wine and catch up on all these years.
Yes, and tell Brett hello and best wishes from all the Reeds.
I will.
Okay.
And tell all the Reeds I said hello to.
I will.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Alex.